that from a legal point of view, the dominant paradigm which shapes our public order is the sovereignty, territorial sovereignty governance paradigm. Now, the cost of that paradigm we saw was in the context of the industrialized murder of human beings after World War II, during World War II, but even more importantly, the statistics from the early 19th century to the latter part of 20th century to the latter part of the 20th century indicate something of the order of about 170 million people murdered by government or proto-government-like entities. That is an astonishing statistic in terms of the cost of the sovereignty paradigm for world order. Now, the point that I wanted to make was that right after World War II, we did have an effort to change this paradigm, and it is still a contested thing. So I just wanted to draw your attention to this. When we had the Nuremberg trials, the obvious defense of the defendants was sovereignty. And nothing trumps sovereignty, so if they said they were following the sovereign's orders, they would have to be acquitted. What the Nuremberg trial did was it said that the sovereignty paradigm is merely an abstraction from reality, and what we need to do is to penetrate the sovereignty paradigm to figure out who the active agents of decision-making are and hold them accountable. Now, that was a real radical shift. If you go back to the end of the First World War and the League of Nations to the present, this really put a pinprick into the question of sovereign, unaccountable sovereign omnipotence. And that is still being fought today. 50 years after Nuremberg, we had great difficulty establishing another international criminal court. Even the politics behind the creation of the Yugoslav Tribunal and the Rwanda Tribunal were fought with efforts to sabotage it by sovereign states. Now we do have the court, but we're still fighting the battle of whether aggression should be a crime, and if so, how you can define it. In other words, there is a great challenge here for understanding the omnipotence of the sovereignty paradigm and the question of whether it can be replaced by something more important for the purposes of world order. And this will ultimately impact on the 17 or 18 or 19 points that Ivo raised about sustainable development, because all of those are in some degree significantly conditioned by the sovereignty paradigm. And what we really need is a far more inclusive framework of shaping the importance and the results that can emerge from this process. So I just wanted to draw your attention to the fact that this is a battle that still continues and a challenge for all of us. Now, getting back to Ivo's rather challenging presentation, well, Ivo's, some of us have been looking at the problems, for example, of the lessons that physics, and quantum physics in particular, provides for those of us who are trying to observe law and trying to figure out what the most responsible posture for law should be in the global environment. And amongst the things that emerge from quantum physics is the problem of observation and the problem of participation. And we have this as a problem in law. If you're the legal observer and you're observing legal phenomena, then at the same time you are also indirectly or even more directly an intervener. And so the issue of an observer participatory universe challenges the most simplistic epistemology that the observer is immune from what the observer is actually observing. And the insights from quantum physics about the impact of observation on the movement of electrons and so on further accentuates and complicates the matter. Now, what of course we have looked at in law is, as Ivo pointed out, the expectation that law is basically meant to provide for stability in human relations. In other words, human relations become extremely difficult if people's expectations are not stabilized. And technically speaking, the lawyers would tend to do this through rules. Rules are rigid, they are unchanging, they They stipulate the condition and the consequence, and this is to affect human relations. Now, this has been a model that has shaped legal thinking for centuries. And there's always been some element of dissatisfaction with it, because hidden behind what lawyers were doing, or at least thoughtful lawyers were doing, was the idea that you can change social relationships without ever admitting that you're actually changing social relationships. Now, why would you not want to admit that? Because change tends to be dangerous. From the very earliest of times that we've looked at lawyers trying to change things, we realized that their lives were at risk. The greatest of the Roman lawyers, Alpian, a man influenced by the Stoics, was murdered because he had progressive ideas. In the time of the Tudor reign, after the Tudor reign, there was Coke, the guy that essentially is responsible for the English Bill of Rights. Well, he was put in jail. His ideas were far too radical for the monarchy to tolerate. So there's always been this problem of a progressive vision of law, and admission that law isn't simply repeating the past in an endless repetition of the past, but really it's doing something more. But this has always been an extremely difficult thing for lawyers to admit, even today. So that when we look at the Oxford School, it formulated a legal ideology explicitly rooted in stability, in rules. And while they admit for some discretion in changing of human dynamics, these are very grudgingly conceded. So we have a model of the law that is an eminent justification of the status quo as it is. What's the problem with it? Well, the practical problem with the status quo as it is that if you continue along the lines of the status quo as it is, we may fall off a cliff. So something more responsible needs to be done. And in the latter part of the 19th century, creative lawyers, at least in the US, began to consider this problem. How do we understand the relationship between law and change? And one of the ways in which they sought to get at this problem was through a famous judge who said that you need to look at law from the point of view of the bad man. Now, what he was trying to do was to say that we can have change without it being contaminated by the subjectivity of morality and ethics and so on. And so essentially what the bad man is he is today the model of what we call neo-economic liberalism. The bad man isn't interested in ethics of what he's doing, or the morality of what he's doing, or whether it's good for the public interest. He's only interested in whether it's good for himself. See? And this has been a pervasive feature of, if you like, American capitalism, and indeed of American law. So that when you put lawyers in positions of authority, what do? They are concerned with trying to figure out the least amount of cost for the bad man. Okay? The bad man isn't interested in the morality or the ethics of it. He just wants to know, what is the cost of my being immoral? And if it's a high cost, I'll pay. If it's a low cost, I won't. See? So that has been one of the models of change, and it is a dynamic model, and it reflects this idea that you can structure law and economics almost independently of the public interest. And that means you have unguided change, and you can go in the direction of the excessive depletion of the resource base of the planet, or whatever else, other resources there are, or even human labor becomes expendable in this particular context. Now, during the war, it became apparent to one of our founders, Harold Laswell, and his colleagues, that law had to be given a more responsible position in the social order. In other words, you cannot separate law from the public interest. And if you take into account the public interest, the education of lawyers has to be educational training to advance the public interest. And if you want to advance the public interest, you have to engage in the discourse of values, morality, and ethics. Now, this ran into a major technical problem in terms of the relationship between science and morality. Hume, the great Scottish philosopher, made the point that you can't have any meaningful statements that implicate the ought. You can't reduce a scientific statement into an ought statement. That's nonsense. And so one of the great challenges we've had in law in particular, but in the rest of the social sciences, is how we can bring science and values together in a process that enhances science and enhances values and enhances the public interest. That has been the great challenge. McDougall and Laswell looked at this and they said, well, look, our problem is essentially what is the most fundamental value behind the public interest? Where do we get it? How do we justify it? And how do we utilize it in the practical arenas of decision making? And they basically grappled with the problem of maybe the real point of law is that it represents an effort, however imperfect, to generate a consensus about the common interest of mankind as a whole. What is the common interest? Well, the common interest ultimately has to rest on some value principle. What value principle? The principle of universal human dignity. Well, how do you get universal human dignity? Well, Laswell really couldn't answer that question, but what he said was, what I preferred it was postulated as an objective, and it's up there. People can take pot shots at it, criticize it, and so on, but it at least provides an explicit, open-ended sense of value and some guidance as to how we take the particularities of law and direct them to some higher and more compelling justification. So we have this today. We have greater clarity on this. For example, we now have come to a justification of the human dignity idea by saying that if I accept the notion that my life should be a success rather than a wasted opportunity, then why shouldn't I recommend that for others? And how do I achieve that? By recognizing the mutual dignity of all. Now, I need to just jump back one. In the context of law, every particular decision, I talked about casuistic decision making, in effect is a micromolecule that adds to the public order. And so the question then is, how do we take these minuscule, particularized decisions and connect them to the larger matrix and configuration of human policy making? And here we have a tremendous number of insights that are generated by lawyers, include the dialectics, the reasoning in terms of juridical opposites and juridical relatives, but most importantly, it's the notion that all moral systems, all legal systems, come in pairs of complementarity, and it's this clash of complementarity that generates the insights for the further development of the law. In other words, when you look at the detail of law as an expression of a micro form of policy making, in the aggregate adds up to a larger spectrum of policy making. Now, this is contested because people say that if you start out with a precedent and you go to a rule, the next phase is you end up as a principle. And then it's more loose, and then you go from a principle to a doctrine to a standard to morality, a standard to ethics. In other words, lawyers in practice have to operate with particulars and with abstractions, and they have to integrate them in complex methods of interpretation. And this is the example that we had from the European Court of Human Rights to show that this is possible, actually. Now, the great insight here is that law is an expression of choice, an expression of policy at whatever level of abstraction. And when we recognize that, we have a better chance of formulating and directing the public interest in ways that we can construe as a defense of that interest. To conclude, when we look at the great challenge to sustainable development, it is, in my opinion, the problem of radical inequality generated by a neo-political economy. Now, what does this mean? It means that radical inequality destroys economic opportunity, the freedom of opportunity. If you destroy the freedom of opportunity, you destroy capability freedoms. If you destroy opportunity and capability freedoms, you destroy human capital. If you destroy human capital, you radically undermine the agenda of sustainable development. Thank you very much.